So I'm Dr. Whitcomb. I am a physician. I'm a physician who is board certified in anti-aging and degenerative medicine, degenerative medicine. I have a practice at Ruby Isle just down the road on North Avenue, and I've spoken a bunch of other times here. We're trying to work on a project that I'm going to introduce tonight. One of our talks is we're going to talk about Wellness University, but tonight we're talking about the great American health scam, cholesterol. And unfortunately, this is such a complex topic, we've had to break this into two sections. Did you get the pop quiz? Do we have some in the back row? Do we have some more copies in the pop quiz? This you're going to see, actually, they're all going to be on the screen too. So you'll see copies of this. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, how do we get to where we are? And what's wrong and what does the data show? What's going on? And what's the real risk with our heart? Like, how do we really get heart disease? What data do I need to know? What can I do for myself? And I'm going to introduce the idea of Wellness University and that core concept. So this is what we'd like to cover tonight. We're not going to get all the way through all the concepts of statins. Statins will be 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now. We'll finish part 2. So first of all, how did we get here? Well, here's cholesterol. And if I say cholesterol to you, you're all meant to shudder and say this is a fearful thing. And because every one of you has been told that your cholesterol is dangerous, and you can't turn on a TV at 9 o'clock at night without having an ad telling you how wonderful you'll be and how you'll be able to leap through the neighborhood and you'll be able to run like a 20-year-old if you lower your cholesterol with a cholesterol drug. They're doing that intentionally because about half the people on cholesterol drugs get such bad muscle pain they can't walk. So they want to make imagery of people who can run and exercise, which is basically a lot of Madison Avenue shenanigans. In any case, we all feel anxiety. The truth is, cholesterol is harmless. Slide number 1. Cholesterol is harmless, and my task in the next hour is to prove that to you. And so here we go. How did we get here? Well, for those of you who are alive and reading the news when Eisenhower was the president, right after World War II, Eisenhower had a heart attack, and then he had 7 more over the next 20 years. And the poor man got beaten to death because he was in the news every time he had a heart attack. And there was huge discussion about it, and it got all of America thinking about what causes heart disease. And so people were looking around and saying, what's the cause of heart disease? And we were looking at arteries, and when you look at an artery, you see all sorts of gunk in there. If somebody who had a heart attack, you see stuff that looks like these plaques, and that looked like cholesterol. And so he said, well, there's these plaques in the arteries, so that must be the cause of it. So there it was, we see it, and so cholesterol must be the cause of it. And they said, well, how does that get there? Well, the most prominent nutrition guy at the time was a guy by the name of Ancel Keys. And the reason he was so prominent is, for any of you who might have ever heard of K rations in World War II and the Korean War, K rations were named after Ancel Keys. So he was the one who invented them. Probably made a lot of enemies by a lot of soldiers, but nevertheless. But his wife was also a dietitian, and they were actually very involved. He was a professor at University of Minnesota, and he got asked, and he said, what causes heart disease? Well, he and his wife happened to be on a trip to Naples, Italy, and he was at the conference, and his wife was out having a good time checking out Naples and looking around, and she just sort of looked at people, and she could tell the rich people were eating an awful lot of rich food, and they were having heart attacks. And they must be having, it's because they're having rich food, and that's when they must be eating heart attacks. And so that's what she told her husband. She said, everywhere I go, I see these people eating all this rich Italian food. So the rich people were having heart attacks, and therefore they must be eating rich food. And what's in rich food? Well, it's cholesterol. Isn't that what's in rich food? That's about the sum of the science that they used. That was it. There's no data. It was just a hunch. It was their feelings. It was the two of them talking about it. Well, that was what you call a leap of faith or a deduction. Or maybe you'd call that empiric evidence, except it wasn't really evidence. It was just looking and not being very astute and sort of starting with something. But to support them, at the time, we were doing a lot of research about vitamins. And we'd actually discovered vitamin K2 by feeding rabbits a diet of pure cholesterol. And when you fed them pure cholesterol, those diets got plaque and they got heart attacks. Never mind the fact that there's never been a rabbit on this planet that's eaten cholesterol by choice. And those rabbits actually often bled to death because they got clotting defects, and that's how we found vitamin K, by adding things back in their diet. And we said, well, they were dying, so they didn't have a coagulation defect, and the doctor who found it was Danish, who spoke German, and he said coagulation was spelled with a K in German, so that's why vitamin K is called K. because it was a coagulation defect. So the idea of feeding animals a diet of pure something or other was common at the time. And so I thought, we thought Ancel Keys presented the idea that fat, cholesterol, and heart disease to a World Health Committee, and he presented to them as though it was fact. And they basically laughed him off the stage and asked a bunch of questions that humiliated him. And he was madder than a hornet because he had never been treated that way. And he was heard to mutter as he came out of there, "I'll get those guys." And that was recorded much later. So he designed the 7 Nations study. This is a very famous study. It got him on the cover of Time magazine because it answered the question, why is Eisenhower having so many heart attacks? He collected the consumption of meat and cheese and cholesterol foods from all over the world. And he called it the 7 Nation Studies. Well, he collected this data from 22 nations, but he only picked 7. Guess what happens when you cherry pick data from 7 places out of 22? You can find whatever data you like. And in fact, these are the 7 countries he picked. Dr. Houston, we have a problem here. Dr. Malcolm Kendrick took the data from the 7 Nation study and found 7 different countries that proved the exact opposite. But Ancel Keys used his data that he presented and published to say there's a linear relationship between the amount of cholesterol eaten and coronary artery disease. And that's what got the idea started. So now deep embedded in the American public brain, so Keys was a member of the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association, and he got them into the 1961 American Heart Association Dietary Guidelines. You ought to avoid cholesterol, don't eat eggs. How many of you have spent years of your life avoiding eggs? I certainly have. I had 3 eggs for breakfast this morning, but so you now know where I'm at. But then came George McGovern. It took a lot of people to get us in this pickle. And George McGovern comes along and he says, he was the chair of the Senate Committee on Health and Nutrition that had just designed food stamps. He was going to wipe out poverty in America and he was making sure everybody got fed. So he designed food stamps and he said, we should not only take care of people who are eating too little, but we should take care of people who are eating too much. So let's figure out proper food guidelines so people don't get in trouble by eating too much food. And he said, let's design dietary guidelines. Sounds like a good idea. Well, we now know that when you get the government mucking around in your personal affairs, it may be more complicated than you think. But he wasn't wanting to do it himself, and so he had an intern working on his staff by the name of Nick Mottern, who was an intern in journalism. And he said, Nick, why don't you write those guidelines? Because it's, you could just find out where it was. Well, Nick Mottern was no medical training, no dietary nutrition training. He was just a journalism kid. And Nick didn't know who to talk to. But here's his guidelines. He goes off and writes these dietary guidelines that basically said, well, here's how the food pyramid said you ought to eat 6 to 11 servings. Well, he didn't do it quite that easily because Mottern was in deep trouble. He didn't know who to turn to. And he figured, well, the best place in the country is Harvard. So he calls up to Harvard, and he knew one guy at Harvard who was interested in nutrition, professor of nutrition by the name of Mark Hegsted. And Hegsted deeply believed that a low-fat diet would prevent heart disease because at that time, Pritikin was just devising his diet. Anybody here know what the Pritikin diet is? Yeah, what's the Pritikin diet? What's the summary of the Pritikin diet? Zero fat, right? And not a lot of animal. So basically, I remember making jokes in medical school about when you rake your lawn, you're basically getting ready for the Pritikin diet. But and the reason I made those jokes is because when I was in medical school, I had an uncle who had 5-vessel bypass surgery, and what I didn't know is that 10 years later, on the Pritikin diet, his artery disease would be completely gone. He completely reversed his coronary artery disease by being on the Pritikin diet. So Hegsted actually was probably right. Extremely low-fat diets are the basis of what we now call Esselstyn's diet, and there's some validity to that. But the fact is you have to be below 10%. And America went from 33% fat all the way down to 25% fat. And the analogy for those of you who are my customers here is I say, folks, if you're in a Mercedes-Benz with 55 airbags around you and you're driving 90 miles an hour and you run into a bridge abutment, what happens to you? You die. So we tell you should drive slower. If you're going to drive into bridge abutments, you should slow down a little bit. So you drive down from 90 miles an hour to 75 miles an hour, and you now hit a bridge abutment going 75 miles an hour, 75 airbags around you, and what happens to you? You still die. If you want to hitch bridge abutments, you need to be doing it at 15 miles an hour. And then the 75 airbags will go off and you'll be protected and you can dust yourself off and get out and go away. Cutting down cholesterol from 33% to 25% isn't enough. If you want to affect your heart disease, there's pretty good proof that we can reverse it all the way down to, but you have to get below 10%. That's a separate issue. Meanwhile, Mark Hegsted moves to the Harvard, moves from Harvard to the USDA, and he's actually in Washington, so Nick Modern went to him and talked to him and came up with these guidelines. And basically, Hegsted called up, he talked to a bunch of different people, and actually there was a whole bunch of behind-the-scenes stuff that we'll never completely understand. We believe Colin Campbell was very influential in doing that, and Colin Campbell was excited about those first guidelines in 1978, and he said, we should have a vegan diet, we should be getting away from animal products. And when the guidelines came out, he was talking about eating whole foods, vegetables, as his source of carbohydrates. And Colin Campbell was deeply disappointed when the guidelines came out showing 11 servings of white carbohydrates a day. And that was all done behind the scenes by various lobbying groups. But meanwhile, the committee disbanded. It was a congressional committee. They wrote guidelines. No big deal. We're going home for the summer. But there was this lady by the name of Carol Tucker, who was a little bit on the overweight side and said, guidelines? We should do something with these things. I'm a little worried myself. And she said, we should do something about these recommendations. That's what's doing. And so she went to the Philip Handler at the National Academy of Science, the most prestigious scientific body in America at the time. And she said, okay, here's these guidelines that this congressional committee wrote up. What do you think of them? And you know what Handler said? It was Philip Handler, and he said, these are utter nonsense. There is no science behind this whatsoever. Oh, well, Tucker goes back to Dr. Hegsted and says, what do you think? And he says, Handler doesn't know what he's talking about. I believe in low fat, and we should be on these guidelines, follow these guidelines. And so the USDA releases dietary guidelines. And behind the scenes, there are lobbyists, just like today, that we'll never find out. And so, for example, Colin Campbell has probably participated in some of this. We're not sure what happened. All we know is that Colin Campbell wasn't really excited about the guidelines when they came out. Because of emphasizing whole foods, we ended up with 11 servings a day of white carbohydrates. And so there was some kind of behind-the-scenes stuff. And so, for example, one clue. The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine filed a lawsuit charging that 6 of the 11 committee members had inappropriate financial ties to the meat, dairy, food, and that kind of stuff. That was what was going on behind the scenes, and this was actually a later set of guidelines, but that was happening. Meantime, so now you have the National Science Foundation and the USDA fighting, and they go nuts. They say there's no science here. They say those guidelines are crazy. They make their own guidelines. They come out and say saturated fat's perfectly safe. There's no evidence it's bad for you. They actually turned out to be right too. And they say don't worry about fat. The USDA leaks that report to the press. And they say the National Science Foundation has got a bad attitude, and besides, they must have ties to the beef industry, and so now the grain and carb industry. This just gets to be a big political mess. This is Washington. That's how Washington works. So here we are trying to discover new science in the middle of a political arena. That's why it doesn't work. So Jane Brody jumps in, and Jane Brody being the queen of all things diet, she's the nutrition editor at the, is she still there at New York Times? I think she's still there 40 years later. She must be in her late 70s now. But Jane Brody jumps in and says, oh, these guys that's in the pocket of industry is being hurt, and so she liked the idea of low fat. And so she jumps in and said, it must be low fat, I believe it. And so Jane Brody was completely on board with the low fat. We ought to have high carbohydrate, low fat meal. So you can go today into a Pick and Save, right, or any store you want, and go look at Sendix right today. Go to Pick and Save and look and see at the grocery store and see if you can find a high-fat yogurt. Can you find a high-fat yogurt? No. Can you find a full-fat yogurt? Only if you look hard. But you can basically find everything's labeled low fat, low fat, low fat. And if it's low fat, if you take out fat, what do you put in its place? Sugar. All right. So that's how we got these guidelines. All right. The average American on these guidelines gained 1 pound a year for the next 40 years. We all gained somewhere in the range of about 25 pounds. I gained 60, so I made up for a couple of you who didn't. Okay? And it worked really well. See what happened to our weight loss from 1978 when the guidelines came out? Look what happened to obesity. Yep, pretty good guidelines, weren't they? This is called the biggest public health disaster in history. We have poisoned America by coming out with guidelines and then letting those guidelines seep into our food supply. So Those guidelines were utterly, completely, scientifically unvalid, wrong. All right? Pop quiz. You got your pop quizzes in front of you?
Yep.
Jane Brody helped a lot by naming names and claiming vested interests from lobbyists for setting the agenda. True or false? It's really kind of false. She just basically mucked things up and basically politicized it even more. Ansel Keys' 7 Nation study was the foundation for obsession with cholesterol and was based on good data. False. It was just a pile of horse hockey. But it was, he did get data from 7 nations, but he just didn't tell us about the other 15 he didn't tell you about. And when you take all 22 together, his data was meaningless. He had no data whatsoever. Our first food pyramid was based on sound science. False. False as false can be. Lots of politics and sort of half science. And I'm sort of intrigued about there was a little bit of half science in there because that low fat idea, but we'll get to that. McGovern had the idea he could cure heart disease with guidelines. True. Naive, but true. Guidelines have an impressive measure of success. Boy, you have a sense of humor, don't you? Okay. So we then embarked on a scientific journey over the next 20 years as scientists in America of saying, okay, let's study this. Let's bring some real research. What causes heart disease? So the first 4, Honolulu, Puerto Rico, Chicago, and Framingham, not one showed a fat connection. All right? The 5th study, called MERFIT, cost $150 million and $15 million, involved 28 medical centers, screened 360,000 men to find 13,000 high-risk men. All right? The intervention group was told to stop smoking, eat less fat, and exercise. The intervention group had 17% versus 19% cardiovascular deaths, not clinically significant cardiovascular deaths, but overall, more deaths. Overall, more deaths. So, 5 studies, 0 for 5. They had a slightly reduced reduction in 1, so 4 of the 5, 1 had slightly fewer cardiovascular deaths, but overall, more deaths. So that one didn't work. All right, let's try again. The Lipids Research Clinical Coronary Primary Prevention Trial, 4,000 men selected from 350,000 screened men, all with high cholesterol, and they were given cholestyramine versus placebo. They had a slight lowering of their cholesterol. Cardiac mortality dropped ever so slightly. But it was a drug trial, not a diet trial. And because it dropped slightly, somebody made the presumption, well, that means you should be on a diet of less cholesterol. But this was with a drug, it wasn't a diet trial. So there was a sort of a leap of faith there. And it was basically the leap of faith was if it's lowered by any means, that's better for you. And it wasn't lowered. Mortality wasn't lowered very much. So that didn't work much. But this is basically how we got our guidelines. Here's how we got our research, and this is what was the beginning of our research stuff. So the NIH holds a consensus conference and says, let's see what we say. So George Mann, for example, from Vanderbilt and one of the Framingham Heart Study said, researchers have held repeated press conferences bragging about their cataclysmic breakthroughs. They have manipulated the data to reach the wrong conclusions. There wasn't a consensus in the community at all. There was a wide Castelli, study director of Framingham, writes, who was the study director from the Framingham study, says, in retrospect, the more saturated fat people ate from Framingham, the more cholesterol they ate, the more calories they ate, the lower their person's serum cholesterol. We found that people who ate the most cholesterol, ate the most saturated fat, and ate the most calories weighed the least and were the most physically active. Oh, that's a problem. That's exactly opposite what you all believe the data shows. As you walked in here today, you thought if you ate a low-fat diet and ate fewer calories, you'd weigh less. But in fact, the Framingham study proves the exact opposite. The more fat you eat, the less you weigh. We haven't gotten to cholesterol yet. We're just talking about total fat. All right? How many of you have heard about the Leon Heart Study? The Leon Heart Study was published 2 years before our current ATP guidelines. Was not included or talked about in our ATP guidelines, but it was done in France. Now, my son, David, is living in Geneva, Switzerland at the moment, trading soybeans and corn, and he doesn't even know what a soybean plant looks like. I'm quite distressed by this. And he no longer claims he's from Wisconsin because he says, you know, when you're trading soybeans, Dad, I tell everybody I'm from Iowa. And he says, then everybody goes quiet in the room and goes, oh, really? Okay, so Lyon is only about 100 miles away from Geneva, so we go through it when we go on the train when we go to see David. So they found some horrible high-risk patients. They were smokers, they'd already had a heart attack, they had high cholesterol, they didn't exercise, they ate junk food, they had high stress rates. These were all heart attacks waiting to happen. The highest possible stress patients you could get. They told them to eat a Mediterranean diet versus a healthy diet. Okay? And that's what they were told to do. And healthy meant limit fat to 30%, no eggs, no more than 10% saturated fat, and eat a gram a day of fish oil. And they got whole grains and nuts plus 1 gram of fish oil. So basically a Mediterranean diet, lots of olive oil. Study was stopped early. The Mediterranean group had a 76% reduction in CV deaths and more than 70% overall death. 76%, not 0.2 to 0.14, a 76% reduction. But you know what happened? They didn't measure the cholesterol and they couldn't prove the cholesterol went down. So they submitted this huge article to the New England Journal of Medicine, the most prestigious journal in the world. And you know what the New England Journal did? Turned it down. Said you didn't measure the cholesterol. That was the meaningful thing, so we don't know what caused it. So they submitted it to the Lancet, got published in the Lancet. So they published it in the Lancet. The Lancet published it. How many of you here take a gram of fish oil a day? For those of you who don't, we can talk to Dan afterwards, please. One of the most significant things you can do for your personal health, and they have some wonderful flavored, lovely fish oil right over there in the refrigerator. This should be the number one thing we can do for our personal health, is to make sure you're on fish oil, each and every one of you. And remember, for those of you who came early and we talked about getting your bones healthy, fish oil is part and parcel of getting healthy bones. Okay, the enhanced study, published in 2008 after 2 years of processing results. If a drug company has really good results, do they wait 2 years to publish them? They've only got 17 years of a patent. So if you're spending 2 years waiting, what does that tell you? They're really massaging the data as best they can to get whatever they can get out of it, right? Vytorin works better than any previous drug at lowering cholesterol. But plaque grew at twice the rate when you look at plaque. It lowered your cholesterol, but what did it do to plaque? Anybody here taking Vytorin? So the question is, how's that working for you? Well, let me tell you what the stock market thought of this study. That's what happened to their stock when that study finally came out. So why did they wait 2 years? Because Merck sort of knew that's what had happened to their stock when this came out. Because that didn't work. Okay, we've now had 4 studies in a row, all of which are kind of big fat duds. So the nurses study. Anybody here participating in the nurses study? That's like 130,000 of you around the country. So there might, anytime I talk to an audience, I always find, okay, not tonight. Okay, there's like 130,000 now. I think when the study was done, it was up to like 85,000. Published in the New England Journal of Medicine. 5 strategies to prevent a heart attack. We can reduce your risk of sudden death 92% if you follow these 5 strategies. Name the 5 strategies for me.
Low fat.
No smoking.
No eggs.
Daily exercise. A glass of wine. Keep up a good body mass index. Get your body mass index to 25. And have a low glycemic, low trans fat, high omega-3 fiber diet, aka a Mediterranean diet. You follow all 5 of these things, your risk of a heart attack drops 92%. Please show me where in these guidelines they show low cholesterol. They don't mention it. Cholesterol is not mentioned in the guidelines. They did not find any statistical significance with cholesterol or saturated fat. They simply said a Mediterranean low trans fats and a little bit of omega-3 fat, preferably from fish. And now, isn't that interesting? Now you're going to see, okay, this is real science. Now we're getting some real science. Now I got data. I can tell you 92% reduction in your risk of dropping dead. Now, I was an emergency doctor. I made my living trying to get you back from being dead. So do I want you to have a 92% chance of cutting my business? We won't go there. Okay. Conclusion. Now this is the cardiologist, Michael Logerel, the French cardiologist who led the Lyon heart study. You know what he said about cholesterol? He's only published 1 book in English, and that book was, we can summarize in 1 sentence, cholesterol is harmless. But the book he wrote in French was, Statins, the near perfect sexual crime. because when you take statins, we'll get to that next week. All right. Pop quiz on studies. The nurse's study has cholesterol as its first item of importance. That's for any of you who pass on your handout to somebody. Make sure they don't see that as true, because if they look at that handout, they might think they'd guess it. Not even mentioned, found to be irrelevant. The Leon Heart study showed a 76% reduction of mortality with fish oil and wasn't published by the New England Journal of Medicine because it didn't mention cholesterol, which wasn't reduced. That would be true. Enhanced study showed Vytorin lowered cholesterol impressively, but plaque grew at twice the rate. Bother. Meantime, let me promise you, Big Pharma that's putting out all these anti-cholesterol drugs is paying attention, because they're doing a lot of research on it. They're saying, okay, we've got all this muddy science. What do we do here? How do we change this? There's this deep belief, there's a deep cultural belief in American cardiology that cholesterol was a problem. So we've got to dig an issue here. And what you find is, and I've over the course of my career, I've worked with drug reps and all sorts of folks in the pharma industry for years, and I could tell, looking back, this is what they were doing, and I was being very cleverly manipulated. But they were paying attention. And what you see is the cardiologists, is the Big Pharma paid big bucks to make sure they had advocates at every hospital who would lecture on their behalf. And these were the guys, because they did lecturing, they got to be known as the expert. Well, guess who prepared their slides for them? And guess who had published their data for them? I've had pharma come to me and say, would you do a study based out of the ER? We'll provide the nurse to do all the research and we'll write the paper for you. All you need to do is sign it. Okay, that's what they do. And so guess what they get? So get these doctors have the time to put into committee meetings, because if you're getting lots of money from pharma to do all this research and you're getting money to pay for it, then you have time to put into committee meetings, and then you get elected to committees, and you go from state committees to national committees. And when you're on a national committee, you can write guidelines for a national association because you're the expert. And then you write the national guidelines, and what happens if you're a healthcare system? Well, it should be no surprise that 7 of the 9 physicians who wrote our last cholesterol guidelines had ties to pharmaceutical industry. And now that you have national guidelines, now along comes, name the 5 healthcare systems in the Milwaukee metro area, and they've got quality assurance committees. And what are they going to do? Are they going to follow their own guidelines, or are they going to follow national guidelines? They follow national guidelines. And not only that, Big Pharma comes along with a whole bunch of tools to show them, here's some statistical tools you can follow. And when you follow those tools, they've got guidelines to show, well, if you follow these tools and you're meeting these guidelines, and healthcare systems are trying to find ways of ensuring quality, and they want Medicare to show that they're showing quality, and Medicare comes along and says, we want you to prove quality, and if you prove quality to us, well, we'll prove quality by lowering cholesterol. So many health systems now pay doctors extra income when they meet certain quality standards. My pay depended on it when I was at a healthcare system. I'm no longer at a healthcare system. I'm now 18 months past. I can now speak my free mind. There are major healthcare systems in the metro area that pay about up to 10% of their physicians' compensation to make sure they're following quality assurance guidelines. And when they follow that, you just might ask your doctor when he tries to put you on a statin, do you have a quality assurance guideline about following statin use? Just ask that simple question, because I promise you they will say, oh yeah, we're checking quality, and they say it sincerely, like it really should be happening. All right? What that means is your doctor is being paid more to make sure you're on statin, and your physician is intensely anxious if you aren't on that statin. And many of you have experienced that pressure when you've gone to see your doctor. And they say, why aren't you taking a statin? Have you had that?
Yeah, I had taken a statin in the past, and he asked me, well, that didn't agree with you and so forth, and he wanted to give me the next one, which my insurance wouldn't pay for, so now I'm on a third one that I haven't started yet because I'm going, nah, thanks.
I need to see you in 2 weeks when we finish this talk up, but we'll keep going here, okay? I just heard this story hundreds of times, and I have so much fun in the hiking club. Last night I had another person in the hiking club. We had a 5-mile hike, and this person in the hiking club was talking to me because they were being put on statins. They wanted to know how they could get out of it. And I had a wonderful talk with them for about 3 miles. It was kind of hot and sweaty last night, but it wasn't bad. We had a good talk. What causes heart disease? The problem is that the reason I do this in 2 talks is this is a complex picture. So you can't just talk about statins and cholesterol without looking at the big picture. What's the real cause of heart disease? Your number 1 chance of dying in the next 10 years, 50% chance, if you die, 50% of the people who die in their 50s and 60s are going to die of heart disease, of men. So this is a big issue. We've got to address it. And what causes heart disease is inflammation, oxidation, glycation, and stress, not cholesterol. These are the things that cause heart disease. And so what's inflammation? Well, sunburn's acute inflammation. That's acute inflammation. A sprained ankle is acute inflammation. That's acute inflammation. An injury or some kind of chemical event, that's acute inflammation. Chronic inflammation is invisible. Acute inflammation hurts. Chronic inflammation kills. And what's chronic inflammation? Well, chronic inflammation is basically what's going on inside us when we have things like oxidation of LDLs. When we get damaged LDLs within our system, that's called oxidation. So that's why we talk about antioxidants. And we get oxidation and glycation. And oxidation is when you get an extra electron on there. And so there's all sorts of ideas, but the best example of oxidation is you cut an apple slice up and leave it out in the room and watch it turn brown. That apple slice is oxidating. Well, you're turning brown inside all the time. If you, after having this wonderful talk, if you go straight down Brookfield Road to Cop's Ice Cream and have a 3-scoop ice cream to make over from this horrible talk, you'll be internally oxidizing because of that high blood sugar that you'll get from that. So where does the damage start? We now know that the damage of heart disease starts on the endovascular endothelium. The physiology has been pretty well worked out. It's the biggest organ in your body. It's the last barrier between the outside world. It's only 1 cell layer thick, but that body looks at little inflamed LDLs and inflamed things going through your blood and goes ballistic and puts out inflamed messages and says, oh dear, we've got to check, we've got to stop these things going on. There's danger going on. They call up white blood cells, and they call up those white blood cells to come on in and help clean up that mess of those oxidized LDLs. That's the pathophysiology of heart disease. What's cholesterol? Well, cholesterol is a component of membranes. It's a waxy fat that's apparent to most hormones. It's critical for memory. It's critical for immune function. It helps transport fats from the liver. I'm going to go through that. It doesn't dissolve in water. So here's an LDL. Here's an LDL. It's got a lipid membrane around the outside, so it makes a drop. It's got a whole bunch of cholesterol and lipids in here that's moving from your liver, where it makes fat, to your fat cell, where it's going to store fat. So when you eat too much carbohydrate, we're going to get to the sequence in a minute, but we wrap cholesterol up in a package that's wrapped in protein, which allows it to dissolve in blood. And this is the transport mechanism that allows it to transport in blood. And the ApoB protein is the docking mechanism, like the space shuttle. It's the docking mechanism that plugs into your cell and that allows you to disgorge some of this stuff into the cell so you can pass it on. All right? Big fluffy LDLs are pretty harmless. Big fluffy LDLs can't squeeze between cells in your endovascular endothelium. Small, hard LDLs, little small ones. So when you go to see your doctor and they insist on measuring your cholesterol, you want to measure the size of your LDLs and see if they're little. If you got little, dense ones, that's a problem. If you got big, dense, puffy ones, nobody's worried about big, dense, puffy ones. You know what happens when you eat a slice of bacon to the size of your LDLs? They get big. Nice. So in HDL, same thing. Big HDLs are good for you. They're what bring fat back from the cells backwards, back to your liver. And so we want big puffy ones because, again, big is good and small is not so good. And there's a couple diseases like with rheumatoid arthritis where we've allowed the HDLs, and it's turning out to be quite a more complicated picture. HDLs aren't always good fats, but they're, as a general principle. And the worst kinds of LDLs are actually called Mg mini LDLs, which are coated with sugar. The more your LDL is coated with sugar, in other words, the higher your sugar is, in other words, the more carbohydrates you're eating, the more your LDLs are going to have sugar on them, and these are the main enemy. And the more diabetic you are and the older you are, the more you have these dangerous HDLs. So getting rid of sugar and diabetes and glucose is the real journey we have to be on. So the real enemy is oxidized and glycated LDLs. That's the stuff that sticks to your artery, gets through the wall, and starts the process of making plaque when you're 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 years old. That's how we get in trouble. And we can make it worse by smoking and barbecuing and having lots of high blood sugar and lots of high food. But it's not the LDL, it's the glycation of the LDL that causes trouble. And the glycation is basically glucose sticking on it. It's getting glycated, it's getting glucose stuck on it. And that comes from having too high a glucose. So I know that's a little bit of complicated physiology, but let's just see if I can pull you through this pop quiz. The real causes of heart disease are inflammation, oxidation, glycation, and stress. And we're going to finish those 4 up over this week and next week. We'll keep talking about them. LDLs are transporters of lipids. They are problematic only when they become oxidized and glycated, which is singed and sugared. True, in a nutshell. It's high sugar that causes glycation oxidation of LDLs. True or false? True. That's true. You're getting the drift. So I'm going down the road. If it's sugar is the problem, it's not fat that's the problem. So that begins the process. These small cells can penetrate back in our artery, and then white cells trying to come clean them up, and those white cells get all stuffed up and they die, and now you've got a dead cell with all this cholesterol in it. And so more cells have to come and try to build up, and they say, oh my gosh, we have a problem here, and they try to encase it all, and before you know it, you've got a plaque full of gunky, waxy cholesterol gunk that's been there for years and years and years. And you have white cells keep on trying to get, and they can't get ahead of it, and so you can't clean it up. And then a heart attack happens when that plaque breaks and makes a clot. This is when you come to see the doctor in the emergency department. Way too late. So the real enemy is sugar. White flour, oxidation, glycation, diabetes, LDLs. So let's get to the real source. So if you want to put out a fire, where do you aim the fire extinguisher? At the bottom of the fire, right? You don't aim it at the top, you aim it at the bottom. So we got to treat this problem at the source, which means we have to understand the source, which means we have to understand the endocrinology of food. Every metabolic event in our body is controlled by hormones. The food we eat has powerful hormonal effects. Food isn't just calories. It's messages that you set off in your body. And a food is a mix of complex messages depending on the complex food you're eating. So food is the most powerful drug you'll ever encounter because it causes such dramatic changes to your hormones in ways that are hundreds of times more potent than drugs. Hundreds of times more potent. And the most potent signal is mediated through what? Insulin. We need to understand insulin because insulin is what your body uses to control sugar. It's our storage hormone. Insulin responds to carbohydrates very rapidly. We're all trained. I was trained that insulin is your blood sugar controlling hormone. Anybody heard differently?
It's your fat storage hormone.
It's not your sugar hormone. It's your, you had it right.
Fat storage.
It's your fat storage hormone. Insulin is your storage hormone. We're going to explore that a little bit. You eat carbohydrates. In response, you put out insulin to respond to rising levels of blood sugar. So it does respond to sugar because that's a superficial level, but it's not a teleological. It's not a 30,000-foot picture that looks at the big picture. Insulin is really, the job of insulin is to keep sugar going into storage in a tight range so you don't glycate yourself. If you glycate yourself, if your sugar gets too high, you get sick pretty quickly. So the humans are designed not to let themselves get glycated until you're finally getting really way out of control. But fundamentally, the job of insulin is to control calories. And fat cells storing calories, a fat cell that's storing calories can't share calories. So if you have a fat cell that's in storage mode, it can't be in sharing mode. All right? So if you want to lose weight, a fat cell that's in storing mode can't lose weight. So anybody here who wants to lose weight has to address the problem of insulin. Not the problem of diet. You have to say, what makes my insulin go down to nothing? So insulin signals fat cells to be tight shut. It puts them into storage mode, and fat cells can't import and export at the same time. So I want to define a couple core big 30,000-foot picture ideas. Annual food timeline. Here's the annual year. There's April to August. You are now a hunter-gatherer in Wisconsin. You're walking, this is 1,000 years ago, you're dressed in nice Indian clothes and, you know. What do you find in Wisconsin that you can eat between April and August?
Bears.
Berries?
Bison.
Can you find any? What did you say?
I said berries.
Berries in this area, maybe, I guess some blueberries. Yeah, April. Blueberries show up in August, maybe in July. Some blueberries. What else? Dandelion leaves, spinach, asparagus. But fundamentally what you find is green stuff. You find green leaves growing the first 4 months. All right? Hunter-gatherer finds, so you go to the farmer's market right now and you'll find spinach. That's about all they got. A couple peas, but spinach. All right, so that's what you find. Hunter-gatherers can find these foods like that. Or else a deer or a rabbit, if they'll hold still. If you come to my yard, you can have all the rabbits you want. Okay, from August to November, what do you find at the farmer's market, or if you're a hunter-gatherer walking across Wisconsin? What do you find?
Squash, root vegetables.
You find all sorts of foods that ripen, like corn and peppers and potatoes and beans, and all of these foods are called carbohydrates. Pumpkins or squashes or foods that ripen at the end of summer are typically larger fruits that have a lot of carbohydrates in them. So what does that tell your body? You're now in September. If you find an apple tree, what's your job to do when you find an apple tree?
Eat them all.
Eat every apple you can get your hands on, because what's going to happen to the apple tree tomorrow?
They're going to die in the winter.
There's going to be no apple tree in November, right? So you eat every one you can. What happens to your blood sugar? It goes up. What happens when your blood sugar goes up? To your insulin?
Store all those
What
calories.
happens? And you store those calories. So hunter-gatherers would find carbohydrates and eat every one they can find. Because who makes it through winter? Those who ate every one they could find, or those who shared with somebody else? Right, those who stored. So our body was designed to eat carbohydrates. And so we have a feedback loop in our brain that says, when you find a carbohydrate, what do? You eat it, and then what do you do?
And then store it.
When you find a Girl Scout cookie, what do?
Gobble it.
And then what do you do with the next Girl Scout cookie?
Eat them all.
And then what do you do with the next Girl Scout cookie? Has there anybody here ever not eaten a row of Oreo cookies at one time? I have tried many times to have just one. I have rarely stopped at the end of a row. Has there anybody here who's eaten less than 6 cream puffs at a time? Okay, no, won't go there. All right. State Fair is coming and I'm looking forward to it. All right. So we find carbohydrates, but carbohydrates are also a signal to our body that what's coming next? November to April is, what do you find in the farmer's market November to April? It's closed. You're a hunter-gatherer, what do you find in November to April? If it holds still, you can get one. But they don't hold still. So you've got to go finding it. So what food are you eating this time of year? The only food you're eating is meat for 6 to 9 months a year, or some green vegetables. All right? So we're meant to be eating carbohydrates only for 3 months of the year. That's how we were designed in our annual approach to food, and now we've discovered something called Pick and Save and the silo. And the silo stores things, and we can make you carbohydrates year-round, so you can get wheat and cookies and Krispy Kremes and French fries anytime you want. But that's only new in the last just couple hundred years, and maybe the last 1,000 years of human evolution. Okay? So the question is, so carbohydrates appear what time of year? What follows carbohydrate time? Who's going to survive winter better? What do you want your body to do in September? You want to store calories. What's the hormone that makes you store calories? What percent of the year do you have carbohydrates? What percent of the year do you have meat? What percent of the year, do you know that green plants are about 50% protein and very low glycemic index? So you really don't get much insulin response in March through July. So insulin is only a hormone for about 3 months a year. In America, we now make it our hormone year-round, because I can go to Pick and Save and buy low-fat yogurt anytime I want. And it signals to my body that I'm now eating high sugar. It must be October. Winter is about a month away. Except winter never shows up. All right? So insulin is our storage hormone, our survival hormone. If you don't store, you're not going to make it through the winter. It means carbs are here. It's time to store. When you eat carbs, your brain says, eat more, eat fast until you're stuffed, because if you don't, you'll die. At least that's what I do. So when Krispy Kreme opened up I'm not sure how many of you heard this story before, but when Krispy Kreme opened up on Oklahoma Avenue, I was still an emergency doctor. I had a night shift coming up, and I went down there at 11:30 at night. There's a line. This is amazing. And here's all these little hot donuts going through the front, and I get a dozen donuts, and I put them on the seat of my minivan, and I'm at Highway 100 in Oklahoma, and I start driving down Oklahoma. And you only need one hand to drive, and they're warm. So I have one. By 92nd Street, I'd had 3. By 76th Street, I'd had 6. By the time I got to the garage, I'd had 9. And you know, it's really stupid to take 3 into the ER. So I just finished them up. And I worked like I was buzzed that night for about 2 hours, and then I remember crashing so badly. It was just awful. But you know, if you don't eat and don't eat fast, you're going to die. That's the instinct we all have when we get carbohydrates in our brain. All right? Winter's coming, and now we get carbs whenever we want. So let me define for you another idea. That's the insulin trap. The insulin trap is this. Your body wants a blood sugar of probably actually 55 to 60, but we're going to say 80 because that's what our norm is in America. And now you eat a piece of toast for breakfast. What happens to your blood sugar when you eat a piece of toast? Goes up a little bit. We now know there's lots of evidence when you eat carbohydrates, it'll go for about 3 hours. All right? So when your blood sugar goes up, you put out what hormone? Insulin. How long does insulin last? Is there a nurse here who knows how long insulin lasts? Insulin lasts 8 hours. So carbohydrates give you pressure up for 3 hours. Insulin gives you pressure down for 8 hours. There's a mismatch. 3 hours versus 8 hours. So for 5 hours, you've got downward pressure and you've got competition because you are storing calories for 5 hours, but you didn't have enough calories to last that long because you just had one slice of bread. So you have to eat either every 3 hours or you feel crummy. And so you have to eat more. So your fat cells and liver are competing with glucose for your muscles and brain. And so your muscles and brain say, I don't feel good. Your muscles feel weak, so you lay on the couch. Your brain feels, I feel awful and tired to have to take a nap. And so you do what I call brownie-seeking behavior. So we could call that hypoglycemia, or you just basically don't feel good. You have no energy, so you have to eat more. And when you eat more, you gain weight. So the insulin trap is basically, you needed 100 calories, but you put 10 of them into storage. So just to break even, you had to eat 10 more. So that has a huge implication on obesity. The reason we are overweight in America is not because you are a lazy slob and are eating like a pig, but that's what America tells you. We are overweight because we are fed the wrong food. And then our body gets us caught in the insulin trap, and then we feel rotten because our brain says, you're starving to death because I can't get any calories because all your fat cells are shut tight. Your fat cells don't share calories, and so you can't get to those calories. So you feel rotten. So the implications are huge because what it means is we've had it backwards. In America, we blame you and say you're overweight. If you just eat less and exercise more, you can lose weight. That's just not true. You have to eat the right food with the right hormonal response, and you have to sort that stuff out. So that's the insulin trap. So pop quiz on insulin. Insulin is your glucose-controlling hormone or your storage hormone? Storage. Okay? If you secrete insulin, your fat cells are slammed shut, meaning you are carrying around an energy supply you can't get to. True or false? Like a backpack. Humans used to need insulin for about 6 months a year in Paleolithic times. True or false? False. Probably about 3 months a year. Okay? Only when so the question is, what economy does your body run on? And I want to introduce an idea of 2 economies. There's the glucose economy. In the glucose economy, your body, each of us, human bodies, can store about 1,500 calories of glucose in the form of glycogen. So your liver has about 600 calories and your muscle cells have about 600 calories. All right? So 1,500 calories. That's why if the lion is chasing you across the African savanna, your job is to run faster than her, because then the lion can get her, right? And you want access to that insulin, to that glucose very quickly. So glucose is there, it's rapidly mobilized, but we can only store about 1,500 calories in that. Now most women need about 2,000 calories a day, so that's not even a day's supply of calories. However, the average woman in America is 30% body fat. If she weighed 150 pounds, she's got 50 pounds of fat on her. 50 pounds times 3,500 calories per pound is roughly 150,000, somewhere to 170,000 calories. So the average woman has 170,000 calories that she's carrying around like a backpack that she can't get to. You can't get to it as long as you have insulin around, because insulin slams this door shut. This whole world is shut tight. And it's shut tight because as long as you're in glucose mode, what time of year is it when you're in glucose mode? It's September. And we're in storage mode in September. And our body has this one little nasty little secret, and that is it takes about 7 days to transition from this economy to this economy. Now in healthcare, we tell you your brain has to run on glucose. Everywhere I go, I've been told, your brain has to run on glucose. That's patently false. It's not true at all. Your brain can run completely on ketones, and ketones are broken down fats. But it takes about 7 days for your brain to transition. And your brain is such a valuable organ, your body is very polite and makes sure you're not getting glucose for about 7 days before you transition. So for those of you who tried the South Beach diet, what does the South Beach diet do for you for the first 7 days? You have a very regimented, absolutely not one carbohydrate, so you can get over that transition time. It's about 7 to 10 days of transition time. And meanwhile, you check your urine every day with ketone sticks. You sell ketone sticks, don't you? And so if any of you want to try this, Dan has ketone sticks you can buy, and the ketone sticks you can check your pee, and if you got ketones in your pee, your fat cells are opening up. And when they open up, you're losing weight. So the glucose economy is activated in a carbohydrate-rich environment. It's best suited for rapid storage of calories. It's driven by insulin, and hunter-gatherer's time is a quarter of the year. It requires precise timing and allocation of calories to break even, because fundamentally, it's designed to be storing. When you're in glucose mode, you're designed to be storing calories. And to not gain weight when you're in glucose mode is a tight wire, which all of you know. You've been spending your life trying not to gain weight, and you're on this terrible tight wire because you can't get out of it. So if you combine that with intense exercise and a very low glycemic food, you can possibly, maybe not gain weight. And you feel really bad when you get out. So the question is, if you want to lose weight, well, then we have a whole another talk another day about losing weight effectively. The fat and protein economy can only tolerate about 1.5 grams per kilo per day of protein. So if you weigh I weigh 100 kilos, which means I can stand about 150 grams of protein, so I can take about 500 to 600 calories of protein a day. Most women need about 300 and 350 calories of protein a day. So if you're not eating carbs, and you're only eating 350 grams of protein a day, what other kind of food's left? Fat. So a healthy diet should be 350 calories a day of protein and 1,600 calories of fat. So what's wrong with that? How can we demonize fat? If you want to lose weight, we've got to get you on a fat diet, because that's the only way you're going to turn off insulin, and then your body's going to say, oh, this must be winter. We'll share. Our fat cells will open up and we'll share. And that's how you lose weight. But meantime, the remainder of the fat, and the tricky thing is it requires about 7 to 10 days to transition and the utilization. So it's managed by the absence of insulin, and there's a smooth access to calories, and you stop feeling hypoglycemia, and the rest of the body, your brain gets first dibs. So that's good. I don't want to go too far down the fat economy because that gets down to weight loss, and that's not what you're here for. But what's the sequence of cholesterol? The sequence of high cholesterol in your body goes as follows. You're in a glucose economy because you have carbs available to you year-round. You only can store 1,500 calories. So you eat a slice of bread, and your glucose economy is at capacity. You're at 1,500 calories. And you eat an extra 100. What happens? What happens to your blood sugar? You actually ate an extra, so the blood sugar you're eating goes to your muscle cells, and your muscle cells say, sorry, we're full. We've already got all the glycogen we can store. So the glucose goes to your liver, and the liver says, sorry, we're full. We got all the glycogen we can store. So your blood sugar goes up. When your blood sugar goes up, your insulin goes up. When insulin tells your liver to make fats for storage, so your liver starts to making fats. Because say, we got this extra glucose floating around, it must be September, we got to store calories, so your liver starts making fat. And when your liver starts making fat, you start making it. But your liver is here, and your fat is stored here, right? And so to get from here to here, you have to go through your blood. So to get through your blood, you got to put it in protein and wrap it in protein so it'll dissolve in blood, and there you are. That's how you make an LDL. So you make an LDL when you eat carbs. And what do we do in America? We're telling you to reduce your LDLs by taking a statin? That's insane. That's not treating the cause. That's basically doing an artificial thing way after the fact. And meanwhile, it gets worse. Because as you gain weight, your fat cells become insulin resistant. So as your fat cells get bigger, they don't seem to gain in insulin receptors. And you have to have two receptors next to each other. So when their fat cells get bigger, now you have to have higher and higher and higher insulin level to get the same level of sensitivity. So you get harder and harder, and along with insulin comes inflammation. And what causes heart disease? Oxidation, inflammation, glycation, and stress. And so pop quiz on worse. Your glucose economy was designed in human history to be activated for 6 months a year. True or false? False. It's 3 months a year. We're living in a 12-month-a-year mode, but actually we probably didn't ever have that in our human history. We have a positive feedback loop with carbs, the Girl Scout cookie phenomenon. True or false? True. We have a positive feedback loop, every one of you. We all are designed with it. When you eat carbohydrates, they taste good. You eat rice, you eat bread, you eat cookies, you eat Krispy Kremes, and you eat the whole box. All right? Patently true. Try 1, try 2, have 6. You make LDLs in order to process glucose, transport the fat, and store the calories. All started by too many carbs. True. So now you know how LDLs get started. We can't talk about statins unless we tell you and you understand how your body makes LDLs. So it makes perfect sense to give a medication to lower your cholesterol with a drug so you can continue to eat those Girl Scout cookies. Doesn't that suddenly strike you? Don't you understand how patently ridiculous it is to treat yourself with something that lowers your cholesterol, which is simply a transport mechanism to get your fat from your liver to your hips? True. It makes perfect sense if you're an exec at a big pharma company. It doesn't make perfect sense if you're trying to figure out how do I take care of my health in this complex world. That's where it doesn't make sense. So conclusion. We got the cholesterol and fat guidelines through a messy political, economic, egotistical process that got subverted to others' agendas. That's just what happened. There was just a mess going on. It was impartial science. We hadn't had enough time for science to play out. 2, the real causes of heart disease have more to do with the process by which we metabolize sugar and the inflammation, glycation, oxidation, and then the stress of worrying about taking cholesterol. 3, insulin and glucose metabolism might be more important than cholesterol by a country mile. That's the real story for heart disease. And 4, our body is designed to run on fats for much of the year. That's our ketone economy. But we have to talk about the right fats. And that's a separate issue. So what will work for me? Well, I think we ought to develop the idea of a data dashboard. And now the marketplace is coming up with them. What's very fascinating, I think, does anybody here know your blood sugar? Lots of people know your blood sugar, right? Does anybody here know their fasting insulin?
No.
Does anybody here know their hemoglobin A1C? Okay. I think we should all know all those numbers because they are all giving us a picture of what our risks are. So we should actually know our C-reactive protein and our ferritin and our hemoglobin A1C. And so there's a company now called Predix, or actually it's called Tethys, but it does a test called Predix. And their logic goes as follows. It is so important for you to know these data because for those of you who want to reduce your risk of heart disease and diabetes, do you know how much it costs America to take care of one diabetic for a year? $10,000. It costs America $10,000 a year to take care of a diabetic. Anybody here want to sign up to become a diabetic? Heck no. Everybody would like not to be diabetic. So do you think it'd be useful for you to learn how on your own to reverse your diabetes? Of course it would be. So the Tethys company went to every insurance company in America and said, we'd like to give people their own personal data dashboard so they can reverse their coronary artery disease and reverse their diabetes and get off their high blood pressure meds and get off their cholesterol meds. So they came up with this test called Predix. And the deal was, we'll do it for cheap if you always allow your customers to get it for free. Free. Now, the 7 things in the test actually cost about $2,000 if you order them individually, and the Predix company does do it for cheaper. They do it for $600, but if you have any kind of insurance other than Medicaid, they won't take Medicaid. But they will do that test, and you can get it as often as you like. So you want to start on a diet and get the Predix test, and then you can try a month later, check it again, see what's happened. My insulin level went, so the best I've seen so far was somebody whose insulin level went from 90 to 4 in 1 month. I personally went on simulated the January thing, and I ate nothing but absolutely, I told my wife, I'm going to do Atkins for a month. And she said, great, you can cook. So I cooked for the month of January. I ate not one molecule of carbohydrate, and my insulin went from 9, which is in the normal range. It's kind of the average Americans, but it's not below 5, to 2 in 1 month. But 90 to 4 was the most impressive. The person who came to me with an insulin level of 250, after the second test, they were still only at 220, and they hadn't lost any weight, and they were having a hard time not eating bread. So they hadn't lost much weight. So losing weight, controlling insulin, reducing stress, eating right fats might be where the story's at. Here's what the Predix company looks like. They do this test, they give you a summary, and then they give you a score, and you can test month after month. You can sort of do, so if those who like to Google what the test looks like on the internet, you can look up images of Predix, and you can see what it looks like. So meantime, we're starting in the Wisconsin Integrative Medical Society. I want you to introduce an idea we're playing with, what you think about, and that's the idea called Wellness University, and just my ad for that, where we're going to get sort of 12 core lectures with 8 electives. Then we get these 12 for them. We're going to say we're going to give you your wellness passport or your wellness transcript. And we're talking to a couple different colleges and universities at the moment to see if we can get them to give us academic credit. And what we've just given you here is lecture 25 out of 32. They aren't part of the core lectures because the core lectures are a little bit more basic physiology, but they have elements from many of the core lectures. So that's just an idea that I thought you might have fun with. We've started, MD Custom is the place that's really piloted it, and so you get lots of lectures here every month, and if you keep watching, they've always got new lectures, and many of you have come to other ones in the past. So I'd encourage you to come into those, but I'll also encourage you to pay attention to our annual Wisconsin Integrative Medical Society meeting, where we'll have more of the lectures available, and over time we're going to provide transcripts for you so you can sort of check off as you get them done and get yourself wellness competent. And I'm not sure if anybody's got a good idea for what we should call that transcript. I'd love to have ideas what to call that transcript. So, cholesterol part 2 is going to be in 3 weeks. So questions, can I take any questions? That's a lot of material to hold up, doesn't it? That's not kind of what you're expecting, but I wanted to give you the feedback for what takes to get started. Yes?
Well, I'm confused about carbohydrates. I always thought of carbohydrates as bread or cakes or things like that.
Yes, ma'am.
You're saying that greens are what we should be eating? Just green vegetables?
What I want you to eat is something that gets yourself to that keeps you at a insulin level below 5. And that would be individual for each person. When you eat carbohydrates, your insulin level is going to rise briefly, and it all depends on the formula of what your body is like and how you process and the genes your mother gave you and your grandmother and your parents before them.
Talking about fruits, apples, things like that. Are those bad carbohydrates?
No, they're wonderful foods for you.
Oh, okay.
If you've controlled your weight and you're not gaining weight and your cholesterol's fine, if you have a healthy weight and a healthy genetic profile, those are great foods. You should have them as part of your normal menu. But if you're trying to lose weight, or if you're trying to reverse coronary artery disease, they might be a problem for you. Or if you have a high blood sugar and you're diabetic, they might be a problem for you until you lose weight and until you get your insulin controlled. What we're trying to do is control inflammation, oxidation, glycation, and stress. And so once your insulin level's low, then your hemoglobin A1C will be low and your glucose will be low, and you won't have any of those things happening, and you won't be getting Alzheimer's, you won't be getting heart disease, you won't be getting cancer. There's a variety of our diseases that can get markedly better when you control them. And so, for example, spinach. Spinach is 50% protein and 50% carb. But the carbs are very complex carbs and get digested very slowly and get into your system at a very slow rate. But bread has been changed dramatically. And bread used to be a whole grain that we've now turned into talcum powder and baked it into a loaf. And so the glycemic index of bread is about 80, and the glycemic index of cracked wheat is 30. So cracked wheat has a very different biological profile on you than white bread. And Krispy Kremes are about 370, at least when you eat 12 of them.
What's the thyroid connection to cholesterol?
The thyroid connection to cholesterol is interesting. When your thyroid is a wee bit low, your cholesterol levels all rise. So people who are quite hypothyroid have rotten cholesterols. That's one of the hallmarks of thyroid disease. So back in the 70s, when we were just learning how to sort out the TSH story, you'd see lots of women in there with, horrible thyroid disease and grave, horrible thyroids. And boy, you put them on thyroid too quickly, they'd have heart attacks because their cholesterols were sky high. And but that wasn't their cholesterol that was the problem. That was they had inflammation going on in their bodies from the low thyroid. In the anti-aging world, we never talk about one gland in isolation. We talk about triads. And we have thyroid, pancreas, and cortisol as a triad. And you can't have any of those three. You can't affect just thyroid without affecting insulin and cortisol together. So, yes?
What about using something like metformin to help you transition to different?
I think metformin's a magnificent drug. Every single faculty in my anti-aging program is taking it. Even the skinny ones. Metformin's a magnificent drug. The reason for that being is there's the following kind of data with metformin. If you take 220 women with breast cancer who've had their breast cancer get away from them, so they now have metastatic disease, they've failed surgery and chemotherapy, and they now have spread disease, so they're in trouble. They're going to die over the course of 5 years. But if you take the 32 women in that group who are diabetic who had metformin, they lived 40% longer. Cancer can't live. Cancer cells, Science News 3 weeks ago had an article, they're now doing MRI scans of mitochondria. Does everybody here know what a mitochondria is? If your muscle cells have about 400 mitochondria in them, your heart cell has about 5,000 mitochondria in it, and the mitochondria is the energy factory that makes energy. Well, cancer cells, that may be what causes cancer. They have broken mitochondria, and they can't process energy efficiently. So cancer cells have to make up for that by having a huge amount of glucose. Well, if you get yourself on metformin and lower your glucose, you're basically starving those little cancer buggers to death because you're lowering their glucose. So every one of my cancer patients, I'm putting on metformin. Okay? And including me and my wife. So, yeah, so I think metformin's going to be a very, very interesting
And
drug.
for this issue with the glucose and the insulin, and that would be helpful to help someone.
Pardon?
For the issue which you were speaking of with the glucose and the insulin, that would be helpful for someone to use metformin to
Oh,
assist
yes.
them in transitioning to
I
different
think
kinds.
metformin's a wonderful drug.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
So there's really no value to getting lipid levels?
Well, there's value because it keeps your boss happy when you have to do your HRA at work. No, there's really no value to getting lipid levels. For those who get my emails, if you'd like to, I did an email about 6 weeks ago on a wonderful meta-analysis from Japan that looked at survival and lipid levels. And what they found was cholesterol. They took American Heart Association guidelines, below 160, that the American Heart Association says is healthy, 160 to 200, which American Heart Association said is watchful, 200 to 240, which American Heart Association said is uh-oh, and over 240, which American Heart Association says is downright dangerous. Guess what they found? Who lived the longest? Those who had cholesterol over 240. Who lived the shortest? Those whose cholesterol was under 160. Meta-analysis, 350,000 people. Published literature just this year. It's like, okay, maybe we have a problem with the way we've been looking at cholesterol. Maybe our entire national structure of cholesterol has been, the Japanese have taken cholesterol completely off their Japanese Heart Association regimen. They don't measure on Japan. They said, stop doing it. This is a waste of time. It's stupid. And the only reason to measure cholesterol is because it gives you a method of looking at how badly you're handling sugar. And so you could effectively say the only reason to measure it is to see if you have small, dense LDLs or big, fluffy LDLs. That's the reason to measure cholesterol. So get an NMR study and see the size of your LDLs to see if they're small.
Is it helpful to do, if there's a family history, to do one of the heart scans to know what the calcification?
Oh, yes. I think heart scans are wonderful. Waukesha has now jumped into the fray, and Waukesha has now, up till now, the Wheaton folks are doing it for $129, and now Waukesha is doing it for $99. So my advice is everybody join in and tread on over to Waukesha. And I'm not real fond of radiation, so I don't want you to do that too often, just willy-nilly, but boy, it's a wonderful baseline drug, and when you're only doing this much of your heart, they're not getting a huge amount of radiation, so there's pluses and minuses for it. But for postmenopausal women and men in their 50s, I think everybody should get a baseline one.
And if
That's
it's
an MRI?
elevated, I mean, if you have calcification, what should the remedy be?
Come talk to me. I've got a whole regimen. Last week I have somebody who's been working with me for 6 months. We've done like 10 different things, and his score went from 420 down to 350 in 6 months. We're real proud of him.
So this is Waukesha, Memorial?
We're Waukesha Memorial Hospital.
And this is Manhattan?
And you don't even need a prescription. You don't even need a prescription. You can walk in and just give them 99 smackers and they'll do it for you.
It's called what now?
It's called a cardiac calcium scan. Oh yeah, I'm real pleased. And I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to get on the marketplace of Aurora and Fredix, who have been dominating the heart disease marketplace. And so Waukesha and Wheaton is trying to get in, because what they really do is if you have a score of 0, which many women your age do, which is, God bless you, lucky woman, then you get to go have a Krispy Kreme or two. But what they want to do is they want to find if you have a score of 150, and then they say you ought to see a cardiologist soon. And I would say, do you want to see have a cardiac cath and have all go down that road, or do you want to come talk to me and I'll show you how to reverse it, and it'll be a couple medical visits and a little bit of a pat on the back and balancing some hormones and getting you on some nutrients and supplements and measuring the important stuff. The Predix test, you can get the Predix test multiple times for free. And it's a wonderful guidepost because it's free. It's not quite free. I charge $15 for doing it. I have to ship it and handle it, and so it costs you $15.
So they went back to free as opposed to a couple weeks ago we were talking that they're gonna start charging or something?
No, they're back to free. Yes, no. We started that was the drug rep made a mistake. He thought he had to charge for it because he was a new guy. He made a mistake. No, we found out, and the company said, no, it's free.
Fabulous.
Right, yes.
So there isn't a Predix website, it's through.
You can't go to a website and get it. You have to go through doctors. You have to come in through, because I have to write an order for it. So you have to go through doctors' offices. There's like 6 of us in the metro area now doing it.
Also, is there a side effect to stopping one's statin?
Is there a side effect to stopping one's statins?
Is it advisable to stop it like immediately if you decide that's best for you? Or
Coming in 2 weeks. I personally think everybody should be off statins, but I'm going to give you the evidence to show you exactly who should be on it. But for my intro clue is there is no good evidence that women who've not had a heart disease should ever be on a statin, ever. Unless you are talking about the value of the stock for Merck. Okay? Yes?
I went to my doctor and got the battery of tests and so forth, and he did a cholesterol screen, and I said, well, I'd like to know what the sizes of my LDL and HDL are. And he said, well, we don't do that, and it really doesn't pay for you to do that, and you don't need to know. And I went, really?
Sounds like somebody who's basically living in the world of national guidelines, following precise data, and just doing population studies as opposed to taking care of you.
Right. Well,
I want to create for you a data dashboard that you understand. And what you should know is you should know exactly what that means. The world has gotten awfully flat. And I tell you, I can't tell you how much fun I'm having in my practice because half my customers know more than me. Because when you have access to the internet and you're passionate about it, you can find more information than I can. So my job is basically to give you judgment and context and direction. But it's so much fun. I have so many passionate people come into my practice, and every day I get to be taught because they come in, they've learned so much, and they just bring stuff in and show me what they've learned. It's so much, I'm having a hoot. Because in fact, the world is flat, and you can learn it on your own, and you should. It should be your responsibility. It should be your life. It's your health. You should understand it. So my job is to give you context, judgment, and vision, but you'll learn it on your own. And it sounds like that's why you're here tonight. We'll come back in 2 weeks. We got some more good stuff to go.
last time I was in to see him, he said, well, what are you taking now? And I said, well, you prescribed it all, and it's in that file in front of you. Don't you know?
Right.
And he made me go to the pharmacy to get a list of the
Now, for those of us who are having, if you can't change your lifestyle and exercise and eat different food and lose weight, then sometimes maybe a statin might be the only way you can help some things. And actually, I prescribe statins in a very few limited places because they are actually anti-inflammatory, but at a much lower dose than the cholesterol lowering level. So, I haven't worn you out yet. No, you still have questions. Okay.
What is the story of you transitioning from an ER physician to what you're doing now?
Oh, that's a fun story. How much time have you got? But I'll give you the summary. Do you know I have a clergy wife pastor. Do you know the story of Paul on the road to Damascus where he got hit up in the side of the head by the good Lord who said, Paul, get an attitude adjustment here? I had one of those. I used to speak widely on Aurora's behalf all over Wisconsin. I was their wellness teacher and educator. And I would say to people, if you're having heart disease, do you want to go to a hospital where you see a doctor who does 100 caths a year, or do you want to go to a hospital that does 1? And it sounds like the obvious answer is you want to go to the doctor who does 100. And about 10 years ago, it hit me like a thunderbolt that was the wrong answer. Because the technology was there to reverse it. Deep in my subconscious, in 1973, when I was at medical school, Aunt Donna called me up and said, Uncle Paul's having chest pain, they're taking him to the hospital. I'm at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, and she's in Columbus, Ohio. I said, call me back, I'm a medical student, what can I do? But Aunt Donna thought I was a medical student, I knew. 2 hours later, they're taking him to open heart surgery. Riverside Hospital is the second hospital in America to start open heart surgery. Paul had the first person to have 5-vessel bypass surgery at Riverside Hospital. Paul was a fencing contractor, but he had access to the library before the internet, and he was a reader. And he was one of those stubborn old farts who would go and read. And he just basically read and read and read, and he found out the Pritikin diet. And he went back to Aunt Donna, and Aunt Donna was a marvelously creative cook, and he says, let's do the Pritikin diet. And Aunt Donna said, okay. And he lost weight, and he got kind of slender, and he retired, and he started working on a windmill at his little mini farm, and 10 years go by, and he felt great. And his cardiologist called up and says, come on, where you been? Here. How you doing? Great. Come in and have a cardiac cath. No. Please. You pay for it. Okay. So he finagled them into paying for it because he didn't want to pay for it. He was feeling great. And he had completely reversed his coronary artery disease. In 1982, I didn't pay attention to Paul. I should have changed my career in 1982 and said, this is the beginning of cardiac disease. We should completely change what we're doing. He had proven, in the N of 1, it wasn't a big study, but in my subconscious, I knew that you could reverse coronary artery disease. And I've been watching that for years saying, how do people do it? What is it? I've been sort of thinking about it, saying, what's going on? What's going on? So when basically, I spent 2 years trying to get Aurora Healthcare to instigate vitamin D guidelines into Aurora Healthcare's guidelines, and I couldn't get them to do it. If you actually go to some Aurora pharmacies, there are many pharmacists who agree with me. When you go to some Aurora pharmacies, you'll still see my face in their pharmacy 2 years after I left Aurora. And you'll see my face where it's recommending 2,000 units a day. But I couldn't get them to institute it because they're not in the business of keeping you well. They make their money from treating people who are sick. And I'm now 18 months past my leaving them. And for the first 18 months, I could get in trouble by saying honest things, but I can't anymore. That's just the truth. Healthcare systems are designed and paid for to treat illness. Insurance companies are designed to pay for illness. I was being asked, how come I don't accept Medicare? That's because I'm not doing treating illness. I'm treating wellness. I'm catching people early and showing them how to interpret their dashboard of data and saying, we're going to create a dashboard of information. When you drive your car safely because you can see your speedometer. When you drive through Elm Grove, do you watch your speedometer closely or do you just look at it once in a while? In Elm Grove, you look at it constantly, right? Because you have learned, otherwise you'll be paying my property taxes for me. Thank you very much. We look at the data in our car as often as we need to, every time we need to, whenever we want to. You should have access to that kind of data on your own as well, because then you're managing your life. My job is to teach you, and that's what we're going to do in Wellness University, is to teach you how to make those judgments and decisions properly so you can manage your own self. So that's what we do in my practice, is I'm teaching people how to manage their own stuff. There's things you can do that help that. There's pretty good evidence that you balance your hormones, get your thyroid figured out, get your estrogen, testosterone figured out, get, those sorts of things. We can make a huge impact on your longevity. So basically, I left Aurora Healthcare because I couldn't get them to start a functional medicine practice inside Aurora. They said nobody would pay for it. And I have proven to them that people are paying for it just fine. I'm having a wonderful time doing what I'm doing. So I have my business card at the window if you'd like to have some. Yeah, any more questions? You've all been a very gracious audience. I'll keep asking questions, but if I give anybody permission to leave, you're welcome to go, and thank you for coming. So, yes, question?
Yeah, not a question, just
Oh.
an endorsement.
Oh, okay.
I'm one of your patients.
Okay. Well, I can't reveal that, but
Well, I can. I came into your office, I was suffering from fatigue, chronic fatigue syndrome, I think it might be called. I'm 72 years of age. You and I have been together now about 3 months.
3 months.
3 or 4 months, something like that, and the difference in what you have done to me is
Yeah.
just unbelievable, incredulous.
Thank you. Well, it's so much fun doing what I'm doing because I have so many wonderful patients. It's just fun because, like I say, the world is flat and people come into all the time and they found out stuff that I can't have learned yet. And so I've learned from my customers too. So it's a two-way street. So appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question. You're recording this?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Is there any way we can get it on a disc?
It'll be on the internet in about 2 weeks.
Okay, great.
And I think I'm trying to get it figured out on my website, making the connection on my website to these talks, because this will be the second one I've recorded.
I've
So
watched some of your videos.
we're trying to make them available. For those who are interested, I've been writing my email. If you go to www.news in nutrition, all run together. It's on the pop quiz here. It's now when you type that in, it comes up #1 on Google.
Yay.
It's finally got onto page 1 about 6 months ago, and now it's actually #1. So there's enough connections and links to it. But you have to run it all together to be #1. If you write news in nutrition is 3 number words, I'm still on page 2. But you can see all my emails for about the last 6 years on the emails I've been writing.
How do you spell that, metformin?
METFORMIN.
Oh, M-I-N.
Metformin.
All right, thank you.
So thank you all for coming tonight. We'll see you in 2 weeks, and bring a friend, and we'll get ourselves nice and tight in here. Okay, appreciate that.